Right now, there are massive changes happening in the city of Vancouver. There are incredibly huge plans underway right now, reshaping the future of the city. Plans including Senakw, the Oakridge redevelopment, the Jericho Lands, and the Broadway Plan. All of these are going to have a huge impact on the future of the city. But there's one plan, there's one development I think you most likely have no idea even exists, but in my opinion is probably the most significant thing that's going to shape the future of this city. I'm going to explain to you exactly what that is, what it might mean for the future of Vancouver, and you're going to be able to decide whether you think it's going to be a good thing or a bad thing. Let's get into all of it right now. My name is Sebastian Albrecht with the Living in Vancouver BC team, and welcome back to the channel. This channel is all about moving to and living in Vancouver, and every single week I put out videos just like this one about what it's like to live in Vancouver. However, this video is going to be a little bit different because I'm going to ask you to imagine what the future might be. Rather than talking too much about what the city is like right now, mostly this video is going to be about what the future holds for this city, and that's a topic that I'm quite excited about, and it's a topic if you're thinking of moving to Vancouver, or frankly, if you already live here, this is a topic you should also be really keenly interested in. What are we going to do with this city as time moves on? And we all know that Vancouver is a great city, that it draws people from all around the world, and it's growing like nobody's business. The thing is, we got to plan for that growth. And so a few years ago, in 2022, in fact, City Council approved the Vancouver Plan. And the Vancouver Plan is essentially the roadmap for the direction that the city is going to go in. And predominantly what we need to do is account for the massive amount of growth that we're going to be seeing in the next 20 or 30 years. In an overarching perspective, that is exactly what the Vancouver Plan is allowing us to do. Before the Vancouver Plan, predominantly the city did much more piecemeal planning and planned a neighborhood over here or another neighborhood over there. The idea of the Vancouver Plan is this is the guide for what we're going to do all over the city, all 110 square kilometers of the city of Vancouver. Now, within that, there are very specific projects. So the Broadway Plan would be one of them. The Rupert and Renfrew Plan is another one that has just been approved. And the plan for Granville Street and the downtown core is another one of the major projects that are part of the Vancouver Plan. But there is one project, one piece of the Vancouver Plan that I find is flying right under the radar, and that is the Villages Plan. So what is the Vancouver Villages Plan? Well, it is one of the foundational pieces of the Vancouver Plan, which was enacted by Council in 2022. So over the last few years, we're slowly seeing these really big projects being rolled out relatively quickly. And to be honest, I feel like this has a bigger impact on life for most Vancouverites than anything else. And as an example, I can tell you there's a lot of controversy around the Broadway Plan. The Broadway Plan is just 500 city blocks. I mean, that's a significant area, but the Villages Plan is going to impact 600 city blocks. So it's single largest plan within Vancouver Plan affecting the most of the city. And it's most likely going to have the most significant impact on your daily life moving forward. So what is the Village Plan? Essentially, the city has identified 25 villages around the city. These are based on commercial zones already. There's small commercial centers throughout the city that aren't already sort of central neighborhood areas. And they're saying they want to add more life, more vibrancy. They want to add more density. They want to make these more walkable communities throughout the city. And so these areas, I just want to make sure you understand, are not already necessarily known as villages. So just because we call an area a village in Vancouver does not mean it's part of this Villages Plan. There are some areas, as an example, like Olympic Village or Davie Village comes to mind. These two villages, as an example, we call villages, but they are not part of this Villages Plan. To be part of this Villages Plan, they have to be identified in the document, in the planning document. There are 25 of these villages. 17 of them are going to be worked on through this Village Plan. Another 8 of those 25 have been identified, but they're going to be dealt with local neighborhood plans. So there might be one downtown that's going to be dealt with in the Yaletown plan, or another one in Strathcona that might be dealt with in that plan. But these 17 villages have been identified as being outside of the typical neighborhoods, but areas that the city is feeling are important to develop and to have an overarching roadmap of how we want to see development. And so I do want to point out sort of how our city kind of currently works. If you've been watching my videos, you know that I'm a big fan of the neighborhoods in Vancouver. These clusters around the city that are really unique, but also they're very unique, but they're also just very convenient to live in. So you can live in one of the great neighborhoods around Vancouver, whether it's the West End or Kerrisdale or Kitsilano or Main Street or Commercial Drive, and you have everything that you need sort of within a 15-20 minute walk. You got schools and parks, and you have cafes and restaurants and banks and places to work potentially, all within your neighborhood, and you never really have to leave that neighborhood. And one of the things I really love about the city is that we have so many of them, and they're so diverse and they're so interesting. But we also have these areas that are sort of, they're nondescript. They're just on the outer fringes, on the outer edges of these neighborhoods, and living in those locations isn't quite as convenient, right? There was a time where those little neighborhoods also had a corner store or a little cafe down the road, like the Marché St. George as an example, just down the street from me, is one of those little gems, but there's very few of those anymore. And the city has sort of realized that people actually really love that. They like to see some life down the street. They want somewhere to go. And whether that's going down to the park or it's hanging out at a cafe, more and more people want that in a walkable neighborhood. And more, the people that are living in the city of Vancouver are living in the city of Vancouver for that, and deciding that they don't want to live in the outer suburbs where that sort of experience is much less likely because they're much more car-oriented experiences. So I think this is a really interesting plan. I think it could be amazing for the city. I think that there's going to be potentially tons of benefits, but we also have to do this incredibly carefully. These 17 villages throughout the city could become much more convenient to live in, could become much more thriving little neighborhood centers. And the ideal, that the direction that the city wants to move in, is that everything is actually within a 5-minute walk, bike, or roll. So you don't have to get into a car. And so the city has realized that Vancouverites would like to avoid driving if they possibly can. So why not provide that? And along with increased amenities, increased shops and services, the plan is also to increase density. And of course, whenever we talk about density, people kind of freak out. And a lot of people in these communities, as the public consultation goes, it's become pretty clear that a lot of people are afraid of the kind of density that might come along with it. But in my opinion, the plan is to do pretty reasonable density. They're talking about townhouses, they're talking about more duplexes, and they're also talking about sort of low rises. So buildings that are in the 3 to 6 story range rather than the 12, 20, 30, 40 story range that we're seeing. And I'm seeing these massive developments that have been happening around the city, at Oakridge, at the Safeway on Commercial Drive. You know, you can point to all of these locations throughout Vancouver where the city has been suddenly allowing in the last 5 to 10 years 30, 40, 50 story buildings and 500 unit buildings or 1,000 unit developments. And what we're talking here is much smaller, more reasonable growth that suits the communities. And I think on the whole, what we're seeing is an understanding that the growth can not only be at SkyTrain stations, but the growth needs to be throughout the city and allow for a much more vibrant, livable, walkable city. So where is this plan right now? As it stands, the public consultation process has just ended. And right now it's being dealt with by city staff. They're going through all of that public consultation and they're putting together their recommendations of exactly how this plan might work. And the plan is in the fall of this year, or perhaps in the very early part of 2026, this is going to go to council and be a very formal development plan for these villages throughout the city. And this is going to start being enacted in 2026. So basically within the next year, we could see our city being reshaped by this plan. Now, the public consultation, I just want to talk a little bit about how that public consultation went. And I find it quite interesting. What it appears to me is that the city wants to look at, they understand that these 17 villages around the city are different. And the realization from this public consultation is the concerns of citizens from one of these locations to another might be different. On the whole, as I said, almost everyone is concerned with too much density all at once and the amount of impact that might have on the community. But there's some of these areas that feel like, well, public space, sort of public parks are more important than others. And then there's other areas where they might feel like what we really need here are cafes and restaurants and a little more life on the street, right? So a very common concern is also a lot about housing affordability, and that's absolutely no surprise. Businesses in these areas are really concerned about parking and being able to get people in the door. I find that interesting because what we're saying is people don't want to drive, they want to actually walk. They want to be able to walk to these places rather than space being devoted to cars. So I'm curious how the city is going to sort of deal with that issue. My suspicion is they'll hear that concern, but essentially they're going to make these locations, these villages, much more bike friendly, walkable, and not as friendly to be driving in, would be my guess. Now, as much as I think this is a fantastic idea, and I'm honestly quite optimistic about this as sort of an overall direction that the city is moving in, I do have some questions. And I'm wondering if you might have those questions too. If you have any questions about this, be sure to add them down in the comments below this video, and I'll try and address them and see if I can find answers for you. But one of the questions that arises for me is, how did we decide on these 25 villages and these 17 specific ones that are being worked on in this plan? But nowhere does it really explain how they decided these were the 17 villages that are going to be worked on, and not, there's at least a couple more around the city that could have been included, but they didn't. And one that comes to mind as an example would be, Main and 33rd as an example. That's not part of this plan. And there's lots of these little areas throughout the city. So who came up with these? Why was that not part of the public consultation? I think that was a mistake. I think that the public should have been consulted. We should have all together decided what are there areas that we really need a bit of help with, and what areas are really just kind of doing fine. It doesn't feel like something that should have been decided from the top down. And that's what it feels like. And I don't know if I'm correct or not, but that's what it feels like to me here. I also, looking at these, some of these are a little oddly clustered as well. So if you look at the far western side of these villages, and you see that cluster running down basically McDonald and Mackenzie from 16th to 41st. There's a series basically interconnected. Why do we have 4 of those, one after the other? Is that really necessary? I would agree, in that corner of the world, there is a pretty big gap when you go from Dunbar over to Kerrisdale as an example, or from Kerrisdale over to Kitsilano. There is a big gap in between. Not a lot going on, but I do wonder if really 4 of those little villages is necessary basically along the same street in those same neighborhoods. And the other place where this seems like a bit of an odd cluster is also around Nanaimo. And so that one at Nanaimo and First and the one at Nanaimo and Broadway. Do we really need 2 of those one after another? Maybe. And maybe one will be developed more than the other. I don't know exactly what will be decided, but that does strike me as slightly odd when I look at it. And then there are so many other gaps around the city that aren't necessarily filled in the same way. The other question I have is about what happens to the existing neighborhoods when we push development in these sort of outlying areas. So when you, as an example, develop the area at Fraser and 33rd or Knight and 33rd, what happens to Main Street? Are we going to take away from those businesses? And we're the people who have businesses, as an example, on Main Street that may not be doing particularly well, that might be kind of struggling. Like, one of the things about a lot of these businesses is they do typically struggle against big box stores like Walmart or Canadian Tire, or against Amazon. And so are we just hurting those small businesses even more while trying to provide more services, more shops, and more opportunities for people? Could we essentially be hurting ourselves in this process? And I wonder if those businesses were consulted, and how a lot of those businesses and people who live in those communities feel about the development that might be encouraged outside of those areas. So what's the long-term picture here? Well, obviously the plan is for these 17 neighborhoods to grow. They want more density, they want more housing to be in those communities, but along with that, they want to plan for that density and offer services, shops, and amenities, the things that people will want within their community as those areas grow. And I think so often that's the criticism of the kind of development that we've done to this point. The development that we've had in the city in the last 20, 30 years has been, let's just put the people there and worry about all the amenities later, right? So honestly, I see this as a much more optimistic, reasonable way to grow. And I think as the city grows, the communities that we have, the neighborhoods that we already have that are so interesting, so dynamic, like Commercial Drive, like Main Street, like Kitsilano, they're going to continue to be overwhelmed. Not just those communities, but the surrounding areas continue to grow. So it makes sense to me that we should take off some of the pressure of those communities and some of those neighborhoods, some of those areas, and offer options to people. And I love that idea. And so I think it's not just me who loves that idea. I think we can also see that in the way that our real estate market has been performing in the last 20 years or so. It's these very walkable neighborhood-oriented communities that have seen the greatest explosion, the greatest popularity in the last 20 years or so. COVID is the one exception, but as a video that I did just a couple weeks ago talked about, the strongest areas in Vancouver, the areas that are not seeing a slide in demand, not seeing a slide in prices at all, and in fact seeing we're close to all-time highs in many of these neighborhoods, are the neighborhoods that are the most walkable, that are the most diverse, that have the most amenities in them. Those areas are very, very robust and really, really, really desirable. So what I think the future is there are going to be an increasing number of these communities, these areas that people really want to be in. And as I said earlier in this video, what I see is people who want to be in the city, who are prioritized being in or as close as possible to those communities as possible. And if you don't prioritize that, you more than likely aren't willing to pay the trade-off, pay more money or lose space by living in the city. And so you most likely will be drawn more to the outer suburbs that aren't as walkable, where prices aren't as high. And you might move to an area somewhere in Surrey or somewhere in Mission that you are going to be more car reliant, but you're saving a lot of money in housing. So it makes sense to me that the city is doing this. I think it's going to increase the value of being in the city. I think it's going to increase the options for people who want to be in the city. And more than likely, it's probably going to prevent, to some degree, to some very small degree, prices escalating as crazily as they might otherwise, because we're just going to increase the areas that people are going to see as being highly desirable. It's no longer just going to be Main Street. It's no longer just going to be Kerrisdale or Kitsilano. It's going to also be increasingly the areas in between. I do think that right now you do have a little bit of an opportunity before this really becomes common knowledge to be able to move into some of these areas, right? If you understand the kind of development that you want to see, one question that often comes up when I'm talking to people is like, they want to move into a quiet neighborhood in Vancouver. And unfortunately, a quiet neighborhood that's not going to see any change, that's going to stay exactly the way it is. And unfortunately, often what I tell people is I can't guarantee that. This is an incredibly dynamic, rapidly changing city where in the last few years, you don't know if basically in your backyard, there's going to be a 20-story building or not. With this plan, we understand that there are 17 neighborhoods, 17 areas throughout the city that are going to see very reasonable amounts of growth and not these 20, 30, 40-story buildings. And so these might be neighborhoods. If you're looking for greater walkability, greater neighborhood connection, more reasonable growth, and a lot of neighborhood amenities and conveniences, these might be areas you'll want to target. And where I would say change is going to happen, because there's no way we can stop change, unfortunately, in this city. But the change that's going to happen is going to be at a much more reasonable pace, in a much more livable way. So as you can see, the Vancouver Villages plan truly is set to change the future of Vancouver, and it's going to impact just about everybody that lives here, and it should impact your decisions about where you might want to live within the city of Vancouver. You need to pay very close attention to where these villages are and where you might be residing in the city if this is a city you want to live in for the next 10 to 20 years. Personally, I'm really excited about this plan. I think this is the way forward. I am encouraged that the city still sees the future of Vancouver to be kind of this more gentle, reasonable approach to growth rather than the mega projects that we've seen in so much of the city in the last couple of years. Now, not to say that there's anything wrong with these mega projects, because there are areas of the city that should see significantly more development, like the Broadway corridor along the SkyTrain route, or really around any SkyTrain station. That completely makes sense. But I am really encouraged by the direction that the city has taken in the way that they want to see the rest of the city develop. And that's basically where much of us live, where many of us do live. And we just basically can't resist change or growth. As I said, very optimistic about this direction that the city is taking. Now, if you're thinking of moving to Vancouver and buying a home, as you know, I am a real estate agent that has lived in this city my entire life. I've been in this business nearly 20 years, and I've helped hundreds and hundreds of families doing exactly what you want to do. Find a home, find the right neighborhood, and settle into this city. I can help you and your family as well whenever you're ready. My contact information is right there on the screen. And as you know, this channel is all about moving to and living in Vancouver, and I put out videos just like this one every single week. And at this point, I put out more than 100 videos. And in fact, I'm not just doing videos these days, I'm also doing podcasts. So if you don't just want to watch me, if you're tired of my face, you can just listen to me on a podcast. Wherever you find your podcast, you're going to find this podcast, and they come out every week as well. And before I leave you, I want to point out that there's a couple videos that I really want to encourage you to watch. And number one is a video that I did on one of these village areas. It's a deep dive on the commercial street village that I'd highly recommend you check out. You can link to it right there. And this video right here is the single biggest mistake I see people making when they move to Vancouver. Check both of those out. Thank you so much for watching this video, and I'm going to see you next week, I hope.